Hello. This lecture is going to focus on an Interreg-Mediterranean funded project entitled MPA Engage, a project that focused on addressing the climate change threat in Mediterranean marine protected areas. The project had a duration of about 3 years and currently is concluding its activities, and it brought together a large number of partners coming from Albania, Croatia, Greece, Italy, Spain, and France. And these partners were research institutes, NGOs, and of course, marine protected areas that served as pilot areas. Here you can have a look at the pilot MPAs who implemented the different activities of the project. And an interesting aspect of the project was that it also brought together 30 associated partners from both sides of the Mediterranean basin, which were clustered in 3 major groups. The MPA for Change group that brings together MPAs, the Science for Change group that brings together the scientists, and the Med for Change group that brings together the policy actors. And the overall idea was to strengthen the different aspects of the project with this kind of task groups. The main aim of the project was to support MPA managers to adapt and to some extent mitigate the ongoing climate change effects in their MPAs. And the reason for focusing in marine protected areas was because, on the one hand, the MPAs function as important carbon sinks, they provide ecologically connected corridors for shifting species, they provide refuge and replenishment zones, they reduce risk and promote resilience, they serve also as sentinel research sites to monitor climate change effects. Also, they serve as outdoor education laboratories for local communities, and of course, they provide numerous ecosystem services. The MPA Engage pilot actions entailed different components. The first component had to do with harmonized monitoring activities. So the overall idea was that the pilot MPAs will implement different but yet harmonized protocols in order to monitor, survey the potential climate change effects. Then also vulnerability assessments were carried out in order to assess how vulnerable the MPAs are to climate change. Citizen science activities were implemented in order to engage the wider public and communities. Through, of course, all these activities were implemented through participatory approaches with the ultimate goal to bring all these different elements together towards the elaboration of climate change adaptation plans. So let's take a closer look at the different activities. So regarding the vulnerability assessment, MPAs were guided to perform socio-ecological vulnerability assessments to evaluate the vulnerability of species, habitats, but also local stakeholders to the projected impacts of climate change. And one of the major achievements was that a beta version of an interactive tool was implemented that assisted MPA managers to calculate and illustrate the vulnerability indices of their MPAs. Furthermore, as already mentioned, the MPAs had the opportunity to apply harmonized monitoring protocols, and to that end, 11 monitoring protocols were developed, which had different objectives. One protocol had the objective to measure the water temperature along the depth gradient. Another protocol had to do with monitoring the conservation status of benthic species, and so on and so forth. In addition to that, citizen science activities were implemented. A large number of stakeholders were involved, primarily diving centers and divers. And these citizens had the opportunity to implement harmonized monitoring protocols as well. And in this way, they contributed to generating sound scientific evidence when it comes to the climate change effects. The project also developed a methodological framework for setting up a participatory decision-making process. Of course, participatory processes are linked to the local context, and this local context vary depending on the nature and magnitude of the existing and future threats of the MPAs, the condition of the ecological resources, past and ongoing management efforts, and the prevailing political and sociological circumstances. So obviously, there is no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to participatory processes. Nevertheless, an effort was made to provide concrete guidance to MPA managers in order to set these kind of processes by adopting the quintuple helix participatory approach, where basically the stakeholders were clustered in 5 major groups: the socioeconomic actors, the scientists, the MPA managers, the public authorities, and the citizens. And these 5 stakeholder groups were involved at different stages of the decision making of the planning process, and with different levels of participation depending on their interests, depending on their availability, and depending on their typology. And these different levels of participation entailed receiving information, which is a very basic step, participating in consultation processes, being involved in different activities of the project, such as the citizen science activity, and collaborating, and also participating in workshops related to the climate change effects and being empowered to make informed contributions in the decision-making process. So, which were the different parts of the planning process and how these different parts fit together? First of all, central to the planning process of the MPA Engage activities was the DPSIR framework, where this term stands for driving forces or drivers, for pressures, for responses, impacts, and state. And so by obtaining knowledge on the drivers and monitoring the effects of the different pressure here with climate change and the induced changes on the state of the environment of the MPAs through the monitoring approaches and through the citizen science and assessing basically the impact, the overall idea was to design informed responses which ultimately fed into the adaptation plan that the different MPAs developed. The planning process was basically deployed a 5-phase approach, and this 5-phase approach entailed the establishment phase, the analysis and scenarios phase, the setting the vision phase, the designing the future phase, and to some extent the realization of the future, which is basically the implementation of the adaptation plan. Of course, these various phases should be seen as part of a continuum, and the specific activities that they entailed were the following. For example, for the establishment phase, basically the pilot MPAs worked to define the purpose of the planning phase and the scope, to establish the coordination mechanisms, to design the stakeholders' engagement process. In the second phase, they worked to build the evidence, so basically they consolidated all the information collected through the monitoring activities and the citizen science activities, in addition to the vulnerability assessment action. And they worked in identifying possible adaptation options and on screening the feasibility and implications of the proposed adaptation approaches. In the third phase, related to the setting the vision, they worked to build consensus and select the adaptation options. They identified key problems and issues that should be addressed, and also they set the foundations of the adaptation plan. The fourth phase had to do with the formulation of the plan, the adoption of the plan, and the establishment of the management structure of the plan, and hopefully through a follow-up project, this plan will be implemented in the fifth phase that has to do with the realization of the vision. One major important aspect was, of course, to harness stakeholder consensus throughout the five-phase planning process. And in fact, based on the experiences obtained by the activities implemented at MPA level, several recommendations were elaborated. And these recommendations basically are the essential factors of success for a participatory process of this kind. So let's take a closer look on these essential factors of success. First of all, it was important to set up interdisciplinary teams to coordinate and oversee the process, and this way the different interests of the different stakeholder groups were taken into consideration, as well as different viewpoints. Then to engage stakeholders early, since the very beginning of the actual launching of the MPA Engage project. Then to create a respectful and trusting atmosphere where the different stakeholders felt comfortable in expressing their viewpoints, their concerns, being open and flexible, so the facilitation team was open to all sorts of proposals and everything was discussed. Defining roles and contributions of the different stakeholders throughout the planning process, so they were all fully aware of what was expected from them since the very beginning. Exploring differences, the different viewpoints, instead of trying to promote one very specific viewpoint. Exploring differences and working together in order to come up with consensus. Ensuring, of course, good facilitation where basically the stakeholders didn't feel being patronized. Ensuring good framing of the issue at stake, so consolidated information about the climate change threat in the MPA was prepared and was presented to the different stakeholders in order for them to have a clear understanding of the issue at stake. Taking a pragmatic approach to decision making, so planning within the powers, within keeping in mind the availability of resources, financial or human resources of the MPA, so what can be actually done in order to address the problem realistically. Enough resources allocated to the participatory process, and at different stages and phases of the planning process, making sure that agreement is being confirmed by the different stakeholders. So different types of adaptation measures were considered by the MPAs and the stakeholders in the planning process, and these have been clustered in 6 major categories: capacity building and awareness raising measures, protection and restoration measures, research and monitoring measures, technological measures, regulation and governance measures, and economic measures. And here you can have a look at the types of measures that the different pilot MPAs decided to include in their action plans. So as you can see, there was obviously a preference in capacity building and awareness raising measures, in research and monitoring measures, and in regulation and governance measures, and to a lesser extent, protection and restoration measures were favored, technological or economic. And the reason obviously for that was because these kind of measures are resource intensive, and of course the MPAs, the pilot MPAs, don't necessarily have these resources to be invested on these typologies of measures. So based on the measures that were included in the different action plans of the MPAs, a joint plan for action was prepared in order to transfer the overall experience in other Mediterranean MPAs. And this joint plan includes 10 measures, 10 priority, no regret measures that can be easily implemented, can be easily included in climate change adaptation plans by other MPAs. So these include the implementation of awareness-raising campaigns on the climate change effects, targeting different types of local stakeholders, such as artisanal and recreational fishermen, divers, boaters, stakeholders involved in the tourism sector, then the development of awareness-raising activities on the climate change effects and best practices, best approaches, and best responses at MPA level, and carrying out capacity building workshops in order to promote best practices, good practices in terms of addressing climate change. Then the setup of comprehensive monitoring schemes focused on climatic variables, species or habitats, extreme events, ecological and social processes. And as already mentioned, the MPA Engage makes available a kit with 11 ready-to-use protocols, also protocols that can be used in citizen science activities. Then carrying out research on the effect of climate change and developing vulnerability assessment reports, and engaging with wide-ranging volunteers and citizen science activities to monitor the effects of climate change, and also applying or reinforcing restrictions for professional and recreational users to avoid or decrease damages on marine ecosystems, developing or updating emergency response plans to address potential greater frequency of extreme weather events, and promoting the consumption and commercialization of warm water species of either native or exotic origin. And the 10th measure has to do with implementation of restoration activities targeting protected, endangered, and rare species. So this was, in a nutshell, the showcase of the MPA Engage project, and you can find more information on the MPA Engage website. Thank you for your attention.